excited to introduce this panel on citizen science and social media. My name is Sarah Sharples, and I'm based in the Faculty of Engineering here. I understand I'm the second engineer you've encountered today. But I'm a multidisciplinary researcher, background in psychology, and one of the things that I do is I run a multidisciplinary doctoral training centre called Horizon, that's funded by the Digital Economy Programme, and looks at the use of social technologies, ubiquitous technologies, in a range of contexts, including energy, healthcare, space science, transportation, creative industries. So I'm really interested in hearing the contributions from the panel and from you about this concept of citizen science and the potential sort of new directions that social media in science communication and science participation might take. So I'm very pleased to introduce our four panellists. I'm not going to read through their long biographies, but it's really interesting to note that we've got a range of perspectives here. So we've got Warren from the sort of sociology of science perspective, Neil from the economics and management perspective, Suzi, who describes herself as sort of multidisciplinary across many science areas, particularly focused in the sort of biophysics area, and then Sylvia from biochemistry perspective. So we're going to start with Warren and Neil, who are going to present the specific perspectives that they have, and Suzi and Sylvia are going to hopefully incorporate a little bit of a response to those first points in their presentations as well. So in similar format to the earlier panels, each presenter will have 5 minutes each, and then it's really over to you for questions and discussions. So, Warren.
Okay, thank you. Hello everyone. I'm just going to present a little bit of research we published this year about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And yesterday we heard quite a lot of stuff about how scientific findings make their way into the public sphere via press releases and how the media report those press releases and how that information changes. And we didn't hear so much about what happens to that information after that and about how members of the public might interpret it. So I'm just looking a little bit here today at how that might work. And specifically, I want to highlight what happens with social media, especially Twitter, when scientific findings are released. And particularly, what kind of meanings the public might attach to that knowledge. So how that information may change. So I'm going to use the IPCC as an example. And in particular, this enormous tome, which is 1,500 and something pages long, which came out in September last year. So this is the latest report on the physical science that the IPCC released. And as you may guess, just by its sheer size, it's not perhaps that easy for the public to make meaning out of this document. What could this possibly mean in the public sphere? And not surprisingly, this takes a long time to be written. So the lead authors were chosen in 2008, and it only came out last year. So it took 5 years to put this document together. Although there was significant pushing and pulling of the text during this process, the professional scientific community remained largely in control of what's going on here. There's some input from governments, but it's reasonably minimal. However, I would argue in this paper that at 8 o'clock in the morning on September 27th last year, scientists lost control of what this meant. Okay, after 5 years of controlling it quite closely. Basically, science lost control of what climate change meant in society at that point. So just to illustrate this, I'd like to show you this diagram. So this is what went on Twitter around the time that report was released. And these are just conversations, communications that Twitter users had with each other about climate change and the IPCC at that time. This is only the top 250 or so Twitter users, so there's thousands of others that are going on below the surface. I mean, it would be too complex to interpret the diagram if we put all those in. So this is very much the top users. So what are these conversations about? Well, a lot about the science itself and the way science is presented by various parties. But there's also a lot of political meaning attached to climate change here. This is meaning which is very much absent from this report, because this report is very clearly demarcated as physical science only. Or it portrays itself in that at least. So the attention given to the report by media and politicians comes under scrutiny. You know, what kind of coverage are they giving it or not giving it? Are they ignoring it? But there's also policy-focused topics in here as well, such as geoengineering and fracking, which are linked to climate change. Fracking is particularly interesting because fracking isn't mentioned anywhere in those 1,500 pages. And yet still there's some sections of the public who see fracking as very important in the climate change story. So that's very much a fresh meaning that's been put onto this report and the scientists did not necessarily intend. And then very briefly, I want to say something about who these Twitter users are, who's taking part in these conversations, and particularly, as you may just be able to see here, down the bottom right here, this purple, is a very dense network of people. So these lines are the connections that these Twitter users have, the conversations they're having, and the size of these dots is how much tweeting they're doing, essentially. And I'd argue that density of networks represents a very kind of dense thickness of meaning that's being attached to this report, which is not present in the report. But these people are certainly not people who all agree that the IPCC report was to be applauded. In fact, far from it. It's a very mixed up group of members of the public, quite a few of whom are sceptical of aspects of climate change, scientists and journalists. So if you see this one here, but these colours represent different groups. So in other parts of the diagram, these colours are quite kind of in their own little groups, but down the bottom right here, you've got a very distinct intermingling of scientists, journalists, and climate skeptics, if you like, who are talking to each other. And certainly on the skeptic side, these people are often very scientifically literate, they've got academic backgrounds in physical sciences, engineering, or maths. So, setting aside the conclusions, perhaps, I'd argue that they're often well placed to ask some interesting and probing questions about the science, and that generates some new meaning. These conversations are often robust, so they're not necessarily particularly polite all the time. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not so polite, but I'd also argue that they're very rich, and that there's a different way of producing scientific knowledge, very different from this 5-year process that took place here. I mean, this was a catalyst for it, but this is something different that's happening. And arguably, the way this knowledge is produced is in fact more meaningful in the public sphere, because you have members of the public who are involved in the production of it. Okay, so just to finish, these online interactions generate lots of new meanings around scientific knowledge. However, this doesn't mean acknowledging the professional scientific community, well, they have no option but to let go to some extent of this knowledge when it's published. And also the interactions with some critical groups, whatever you want to call them, may also be more fruitful than they're often regarded. That's all I would say.
So our next presenter is Neil Lancastle from the University of Leicester.
Yes, not a doctor yet. Yes, so I'm here to talk about a student-led project, a voluntary project, so this is really just a bit of fun. So I'm starting with a joke, which is always a bad way to start a presentation. But I'm also responding to this idea of what happens when you lose control. So economics as a social science is a very messy topic. What the students have been doing all around the country really is trying to bring some pluralism into the debate. So there's been groups in Essex, Manchester, Glasgow, Sheffield, LSE, UCL, inviting professors from other departments to give talks outside of the curriculum, and in the case of Manchester, actually putting on their own alternative course about bubbles, manias and panics, I think it's called. The idea is to bring new perspectives, particularly around inequality, distribution, the environment, and growth, and also bring in some critical thinking. The players in this, there's a couple here you might know who they are. Some of them are people, going back to what James said, there's people on the inside looking out. So there are some reformists, if you like, in the Royal Economic Society. There's a key person, Diane Coyle, who I think is chair of the BBC, key person in the BBC. So there are these people on the inside looking out, with support from, at times, people like INET and George Soros, as the funding. But on the outside, with Rethinking, we've also got support from hedge funds, from people like Andy Haldane, the Bank of England, and we've got the old curriculum, if you like, so Lord Skidelsky, Hatchett and Chang, people like that. So there's an outside in and there's an inside out. The problem, as we see it, is that economics is often portrayed as if you're different, you're a maverick, you're a loner, there's something odd about you. And also, one of the other key players is the QAA, I think we mentioned earlier. The QAA, because there's a national curriculum, effectively, there's a bit of a monoculture. Some people might even say cartel in terms of the curriculum. Previous attempts, there was a 1992 attempt by people like Galbraith, Goodwin, Kimballberger to get more pluralism in economics. There have been movements in Germany, in France, there was the Mankey walkout, so there are lots of events. So I've talked already about what we do, the films, the conferences, the events that we run, the discussions we have here at the SPSE. But I want particularly to talk about, coming back to communication, the student letter that we did. So on the 5th of May, we published originally in 8 languages, I think we're up now to about 10, simultaneously in eight languages. We published the same student letter. We got 29 press mentions in 14 countries within 36 hours. So we're in Le Monde, El Mundo, the Financial Times, the comic I showed you from the FT, the Guardian, the Observer, the Marker in Israel, Handelsblatt in Germany, etc. So it was a big hit instantly internationally. And then just to give you, we got 2,000 signatures, so compared to one of the previous pleas by Hodgson, I think we've been, not that it's a competition, but we got quite a lot of signatures. We got in 2 weeks what he got in 4 weeks. I mean, this is really quite detailed stuff, so the idea that you can even get some of these terms perhaps it's a difficult message to get across. Some of the responses from the Financial Times, a lot of people like, so economic students in the world unite. This is a £9,000 lobotomy, which is one of my favourites. And we already have some very positive press because of that big hit. So Ha-Jun Chang and Jonathan Aldred, who immediately backed, supported us. So it did seem to work. That kind of one hit did seem to work. And then just to wrap up, if you want to find out more, these are some of the societies. So this is the kind of umbrella of the UK. This is Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism. This is the group in Manchester. This is the group in News. This changes, and you have to keep. It's a network. It's very fluid. This is a new group in Glasgow that formed in the last 6 to 12 months. So there's lots of societies that you can join if you're a student to get involved in the debate.
So next up we have Suzi Jarvis from University College Dublin.
Is everybody okay if I remain seated?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So first of all, I should say that I feel quite uncomfortable sitting on a panel with new social media in the title at the age of 45. I have a feeling that there are probably other people in the audience under the age of 30 who might have a lot more to contribute to this area. But that said, that really, I suppose, focused my attention a bit on how I can add value to this debate, to this panel. And I think it might be useful to explain why I'm sitting here in the first place, which is because of Philip, who I've known for probably 20 years. And that's something that I think when you're first starting off in your career around the age of 20, you don't realise how much your perspective on your field is going to change as you get older. And speaking to Philip, I haven't seen him very often over the last 20 years, but when I met him again in February, I realised that we were both, I suppose, not going through a midlife crisis as such, but I call it a midlife realisation, which is where you start to look a lot more critically at your discipline and how it's developing. And for Philip, it was a lot around communication of science and science publishing and that kind of thing. For me, it was a lot more around education and how we educate young people in the sciences. And that had really come about because the university where I work in Dublin had decided that they were going to set up something called the Innovation Academy. And the original vision for the Innovation Academy, I think, was to take PhD students primarily from the sciences and give them business skills. And that sounded like such a hideous prospect to me that I applied to be director of the Innovation Academy, which I've been for the last 3 years. And from that kind of worrying original concept, I've started to consider a lot around what are the problems with the way we teach, particularly in higher education, obviously. Looking at the way that we're siloed into disciplines and the impact that that has on the development of our discipline and our own personal development. And also looked at problems with engagement of staff and students, and I think this is becoming an increasing social problem at the moment, that a lot of students, particularly because of the way that we teach in universities a lot of the time, are becoming increasingly disengaged. And we also find people in the workforce becoming increasingly disengaged. So the Innovation Academy, as I developed it, has become a mechanism to provide a transformational educational experience for the betterment of society and the economy. So it's quite general beyond individual disciplines. And we've set out our own values, which are equality of opportunity and respect for diversity. And that was something else that really I hadn't started to think about until quite recently, is what are the values and motivations that drive me as an individual in a particular area. So we bring together people across disciplines, and that by definition forces people to communicate outside their discipline. And we start to look at a lot of the things that were mentioned this morning, like leadership, communication, politics, dealing with ambiguity, things that actually I know I certainly never really came across during my education. So I think, by looking at some of the key themes this morning, we can tell that there probably is a deficit in our education system at the moment. Although these ideas really aren't new. So my university was established by a guy called John Henry Newman. I don't know if anybody has come across John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman. So 150 years ago, he was talking about how we need to educate people outside individual silos or for an individual purpose to be members of society. And it's interesting that 150 years later, the university is kind of coming around to the same way of thinking. But I suppose I just wanted to end with one particular thing that's been on my mind at the moment, and that's how leadership emerges in an academic context. Because I think a lot of the issues that we're starting to consider at the end of the day come down to leadership. And of course, if you want to be a leader, you have to have followers. And I think in academic communities, we do tend to work in isolation a lot. And especially thinking about how we develop as leaders and our own kind of personal development in a university context is quite problematic. And it's problematic when you start to think about how you teach leadership. It's pretty much impossible to teach leadership. I think it's a highly experiential process. And I think it's also what makes it even more difficult is that it's an experiential process that often involves negative experiences. We tend to learn far more about leadership from negative experiences than from positive experiences. And when you go through that process of having a negative experience and learning from it and self-reflecting on it, you then need the opportunity to reinvent yourself based on those experiences. And I think, again, our academic communities tend to be very static over long periods of time. And that process of reinvention is very difficult when you're surrounded by colleagues that you started your PhD with 20 years ago. So those are just some of the things that are on my mind at the moment that I hope I can bring into the debate.
So our final panellist is Sylvia McLain from the University of Oxford.
I'm going to stand up just because I feel like it. And my legs falling asleep. So I'm not really sure why I'm here, but I do kind of feel like the enemy because I'm a scientist. And so I've been taking some quotes throughout the conference about what all of the other wonderful panelists have been saying about scientists. And I'm going to start with yesterday. And these are just some of the things that I've heard, and I might be oversensitive, but scientists can't communicate. Scientists are communicating with the wrong people. Scientists are asking the wrong questions. Scientists are self-indulgent. Scientists think they know best, but often don't. Scientists, where's the other one? I have really good one. Scientists should never communicate. Scientists have a fundamental misunderstanding of evidence. And so, or how it works in policy. Sorry. So there's a lot of negative comments about scientists, I feel like. And I think what that brings up is that scientists don't become people that aren't people in this model. Scientists are a global body of scientists. Now, I'm not really sure what that means, but I think as a scientist, you read these kind of statements and think, well, I'm not like that. I don't work on climate change. You know, I don't work for big pharma, although I wish I did back sometimes because I make more money. But I don't have, a lot of us on the ground roots, you know, at the grassroots level, don't actually have these kind of investments. In fact, I use social media sometimes to promote my research, you know, and I'm excited if anybody reads my research, you know. I want people to look at it and criticize it and talk to me about it. And I think most of us actually operate on that level. The media, however, is overwhelmed by certain people, you know, and some scientists, I will agree, have not made it better for the public perspective of science. There's a lot of hubris, but I don't think that's the only model of scientists. Now, one of the things that's wonderful about social media is I think social media is actually changing that. Because you can interact with people, you can write blogs, you know, that other people can read or not read or choose to understand, but actually this identification of scientists as being more than the people that advise the government about climate change, the people that hate big pharma, or the people that love big pharma, and all these kind of interesting funding mechanisms. So I think it's actually a really important venue for that to occur. I have a very weird background. I'm clearly from the US. My undergraduate degree is in zoology. My master's degree is in education, which I hated teaching. I hated teaching at the secondary school level, I should say. And now I was a physicist, I'm a PhD in chemistry. Then I was a physicist, now I'm a biophysicist, whatever that means. So I think if you look in detail at many scientists, we do have a broad background. We are actually people. And I know that I'm going to run a really short time, which is maybe good that other people can talk about. But these are just some sort of things I've been thinking. The other thing that I find really interesting, and this is because I found this sort of new social media and citizen science. So citizen science to me means something that they do quite well in environmental science. I know that the sort of bird survey people did a really, really good job with actually getting people involved in actually being scientists, so they could go out, characterize birds. There's a big butterfly project in the US when there was a trouble with milkweed, and that's a great place for people to participate. Now, most scientists don't have that at their disposal. You know, for me to get somebody to come work in my lab would be a nightmare. You know, I'd have to go through all of this administrative stuff. We would have to start from ground zero. There'd be a lot of trouble with that. But I think there is some interplay as we, as scientists, can actually learn how to engage and listen to the community better. It's not that easy to do. So from day-to-day operations, you write a grant, you do a certain bit of research, but it's usually very small. So I think there's one kind of conceptual misunderstanding of what we do all day, which is we look at tiny little things. Okay, and our evidence is very tightly and heavily controlled. You want to look at this thing, you test that system, you measure this, and we move forward incrementally. When you come out with policy, the world goes bonkers, and it's really hard to keep up with that. But as scientists, I think we do actually have a role where we listen to people and try to explain what science is, more than what science has told us, but how it actually works. And I think sometimes there's a problem with how we translate that to, I'm looking at this tiny thing through a microscope, and I'm trying to see if my bacteria goes right or left, right? And I'm counting those all day long. And how does that actually branch out to the rest of the world? So I'm not sure we're good at that, but I'll shut up now.
Thank you. So I think we've had some really interesting perspectives there on sort of the individual-led sort of Twitter interactions with scientists, the maybe organised group approach to challenging the way in which economics is taught, considerations of science as leaders and how leadership emerges in that kind of context, and then generally actually how do we engage those in the general public more in science, perhaps in those more challenging areas where the traditional citizen science approach is maybe harder to apply. So I'd really like to now open the floor to questions. And if I could ask you to just sort of state your name and affiliation before you ask the question, please.
I found my hackles rising when you were talking about leadership. Leadership implies a sort of arrogance, which I find absolutely appalling. The people who I admire in science, who have inspired me, like Pearce and my particular area, weren't leaders, they just did stuff. They did it very well. This rise of leadership, for instance, is largely comes from HR. People who can't do anything else don't be leaders.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that.
Well, I'm surprised that you have such a strong response to the idea of leadership, because all our universities are led by vice-chancellors. And we've had the chief scientific advisor here this morning. And our social structures often either defined as leaders through some arbitrary process, or they manage as leaders, or the definition of a leader is who have followers. So I mean, if you have somebody with 5,000 followers on Twitter, are they a leader in that area? Do they have an opinion that you want to follow? Yes, they do. So
9,000, that doesn't make me a leader, it just makes me sound like you shout.
People must like to shout.
well, whether you define yourself as a leader or not is by the by. What we're talking about now is a use of language, and some people describe you as a leader because you have 9,000 followers on Twitter. Now, whether you feel comfortable with that or not is a separate issue, but it comes down to different ways that different people communicate the same concept. I don't
be a harmful way, rather than a neutral way. And people want to be leadership, it was this duties as well.
the antis and the lots of different things.
Okay.
Just social media side fascinates me in two areas. I'll give you examples. When we talked about with Ian Boyd today, two issues. One, the neonicotinoid insecticides, one when I was dealing in the pesticide industry. There was a huge amount of activity on social media about pollinators and about bees. It wasn't necessarily all well factual science-based, but it became an extremely emotive thing that connected a lot of people, and a lot of people got involved to a point where actually, when you were on the other side of the fence where I was trying to defend the use of products that gone through a very long regulatory system at great cost and expense, with people saying, I don't like them, they've got to go because I've been told they're going to kill bees and I want to protect bees, it became a very difficult thing to deal with. And actually that campaign reached a crescendo that influenced the European Commission, European Food Safety Authority, to then take decisions to remove those chemicals across Europe for 2 years at huge expense to the companies concerned. I actually think looking back, that's probably not a bad situation in the sense it gives 2 years to do some proper research in that area. But I think what it does show is that do not underestimate the power of social media to achieve change. There were big multinational corporations that were not able to hold that process back, which was largely social media led. And on the Badger side where I am now, I'm using that in the same way, in the sense of campaigning by connecting people together who are becoming increasingly educated and well informed. And in that process there are scientists who are sharing their views and thoughts, particularly those that might have been involved, for example, in the randomized badger cull project back in the 1990s. Scientists well known in the field like Dr. Chris Cheeseman, people like John Krebs and others, they are actively involved in putting their views back into this process, which is influencing people to say, actually, the science doesn't add up in this policy area, and putting pressure on people like Ian Boyd to say, you've got it wrong. And what I find fascinating about social media is that it can work in two ways. It can be a very negative force, and it can be a complete forum for abuse and horrible things going on, but equally it can be a very, very powerful one for scrutiny, for mobilisation, for connecting people and sharing information to move an issue forward. And I think in the realms of science, that's going to become, in some ways, difficult to deal with, but equally probably a positive challenge for policymakers in science and how you communicate what you're doing. So just from perspectives from mine on two sides.
Thank thank you. I think that's really interesting. I'd actually like to ask Neil to respond a little bit. One of the things I was quite interested in from your presentation was how you mobilised the groups that were involved in putting together the letter, and what role you felt social media, as opposed to maybe other, you talked about sort of formal groups and conferences and things like this, what role other mechanisms played in sort of mobilising that?
Yeah, the only thing the main thing is that we on the one hand, we're definitely creating new leaders. So I don't do Twitter, but I know that on Twitter, some people are putting their own names out. And we talked about this, I think, earlier, that some of those people will go on and become journalists, they'll go into journalism themselves. So I think there's definitely things happening there. But the power of really, or the interesting aspect of it is it has the editorial control. So you cannot be a 24/7 editor on a voluntary project. So what we've done on the main page is we have editors in each country, in each time zone for each language, and that shares the distribution. But the editorial is really where the power is, if you like. So they're not leaders, they're editors. It's a different way of working.
So is there therefore an implied trust in that editorial role, and what level of consensus needs to be achieved?
There's a very high level of trust, and it depends very much on the qualities of the people that come in. So the people that work best in that environment are very collaborative, there's a high level of trust, they're very good communicators. It's a different set of attributes for leadership to the kind of person who becomes a vice chancellor, I think.
I guess linking the previous session and the present, we're hearing this session about the problems of discipline-based scientific endeavour, in a sense, when disciplines can be very constraining and exclude particular points of view, which is partly what they always do. And then Stephen Turner in the previous session was talking about other ways in which the institutional framework of science militates against things that other people would hold to be the scientific ideal. And he suggested that some of the emerging things through social media and the blogosphere may in fact be a better institutional framework for producing useful knowledge for society than the entire scientific enterprise, or at least as an adjunct to the scientific enterprise and a better place to go. I guess I'm kind of interested in your reflections on that, much as the enormous question.
I think that's sort of an interesting question. It's this idea that science is an institution versus people. So one of the things I found troubling in the last discussion a bit was this idea that scientists shouldn't advocate, meaning that it reminds me of these human calculator people. So before there was calculators, you used to call up the human calculator and say, what's 632 by 58, and somebody would just give you an answer and hang on the phone, So I do think you have to be a bit careful about that, but then again, institutions have a different role than individual scientists, right? Institutions that they have a different sort of mechanism. It's just like individual people have a different mechanism than the state. The state in principle would say more, just like people who do more. But I think that delineation in science and the body of science and the way we work is a very difficult thing to do. Because it's usually never quite that cut and dry. So if you are very passionate about something, or you can see something that you think is logical, I'm not saying it is, it's very important. But I also think one of the things that I think is not quite related to what you're saying, but is important to remember, is that scientists aren't the sort of mecca of truth or rationality. Plenty of scientists can be totally irrational, So I think you do have to have an institutional thing that's separate from individual scientists. But I think that's where social media comes into its own. So one of the good things about Twitter is if you're clearly mad, people can tell that on Twitter, right? But it does give you a personality that's a bit distinct from I'm just a scientist saying something, So if you've got somebody that's just saying bonkers stuff, they may or may not be a scientist, but you can actually, make me understand that this person's a little crazy or not,
Can I just ask for clarification by what we mean by an institution? Do we mean a university? Do we mean a journal publisher? Do do we mean a professional institution? I mentioned ethical engineering, we're governed by the professional institutions very strongly.
But I think that's in the context of science. There are again different roles. So, for instance, I work in the institution, and my institution has a different message to deliver than I do. So that's why everybody knows what it is. Like, you know, my views are mine, not my institution's, right? But I do think that, you know, if an institution wants to, so I'm in sort of bogged down in detail, but I think it is a difficult. It's not a perfect delineation, but it's also, you know, a university can't come out often shouldn't come out and say, you know, I believe this, as opposed to individuals who don't make that.
Science functions like all small businesses, doesn't it? In reality, this institution is irrelevant. Most of us anyway. We just get on doing our experiments. Of course, science does require data, but that's why you can't do science on Twitter.
I guess so. There's two things here. One is the sort of thing that Steve was talking about, in that kind of using the blogosphere and Twitter to kind of scrutinise the politics of science. I mean, McLain's books are a good example of this, like that farm. And but then also, is the possibility that this might contribute to the way science is done as well, as that perhaps would be a more fundamental thing. So you started to see this sort of extended peer review, things like peer, which was mentioned yesterday, and more informally on blogs. But I mean, this has the potential to unravel science a lot more in the way that it's done. So I mean, people like, say, platforms like McLain, where you have this kind of ongoing peer review, you have the possibility that you won't just have a finished paper that is released. You have this ongoing research. That's kind of the logical conclusions of these things. And that's certainly what some people who are starting to these platforms might have been interested in changing the model of the way that science is done. Whether that's a good thing or not, but it would be a very fundamental change to the way that science is done.
Well, ventilation fails to do that,
Isn't it?
So I don't have to. So you all get free. You don't need these companies that are doing their best to destitute as much large streets.
So we have a question from, okay.
So, Alistair Tate, University of Nottingham. I'm interested in how the social media blogosphere actually sort of challenges the hierarchy of academic science. We have now perhaps bloggers and Twitter users who are very junior researchers, PhD students, who have many thousands of followers. They're picked up in the media, they write for national columns, and they perhaps have a bigger following and a bigger impact than perhaps their supervisors and really esteemed professors. And secondly, we talk about peer. I think it's a great platform, it has much potential. I think we forget there's still a lot of actually inertia and resistance in some disciplines of science and more general academia towards social media. There's an example last year where there were 2 papers published in chemistry. There was clearly fraudulent data that was reported. This was picked up in blogs and in social media. The response of the editors of the journal was to criticise the blog writers and the social media users for going down the wrong channels, rather than actually criticise necessarily the work, although it has been retracted.
Thank you. Dr. Moore, I'd like to respond to that.
I was just going to say very quickly, you should, I don't think you should just as it. One of the problems we have is with the research excellence framework. So in economics, the older it is and the more quantitative it is, there is this a little bit of a cartel going. So, and you do see a little bit that in the blogosphere. I think you shouldn't confuse followers with impact. But coming back to what was being said earlier about is there original research, there's very, very good content analysis in economics happening in the blogosphere, but it's not happening at all in academia. So they're unpicking not just what the Fed says, but what Krugman says or what the big economists say. And it's very, very interesting, but it's not published research.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone wants to respond on the point as the impact of social media on hierarchy and seniority within academia at all.
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite hard to glean how particular researchers gain a lot of followers sometimes. But what does happen is that does have an impact on the media. I think that's the important thing, is that the media increasingly is looking at blogs, including Twitter, for comment and for content. And this kind of ties widely misunderstood. Andy, what did you say yesterday about the pressures that some scientists are coming under? This is quite an easy way, I think. Not to say that these blogs are not kind of not useful in their content, but it's quite an easy way for scientists to get abreast, journalists to get abreast of what's going on in the field. So you have another route there of influence. It's not necessarily on the people who are following on blogs or Twitter, but this then goes through the media, which obviously has a much broader impact.
I can speak about that to my cost, where I tweeted about the traffic in Beeston a few weeks ago, and now myself quoted it, not to me. Very
similar arguments in the way which you can't really predict. I mean, I can write a blog saying Professor Jeffrey Katz, he's Vice Chancellor of Westminster University, says he doesn't teach studio science, that is untrue. I can't think of any journal that will publish anything that way. But it won't be kind of good.
Right, you know.
I just want to follow up on this issue of different social media. So I wonder what you think about the future of these different platforms, because it's surprising how many academics use Twitter given the limited format of 140 characters. So what can you say unless you have a very tiny file linked in it? And I think that's the attraction to many academics to self-promote and to show that they've published something or have some interesting materials to show. But you know, Facebook arguably is on its way out, as many claim. What is the future for Twitter, and is it the ideal platform, or is it rather limiting, and what other social media would be better use for academics? And another question for Neil, I mean, just to inform us about the success of your campaign, would you give us a sort of overview? Where are departments that have more heterodox economics teaching, and how much impact have you made, or are you expecting to make in the future?
Okay, so if I can ask Neil to respond to that point first, and I'm going to ask all the panellists to present their view on sort of almost what they see as their future for social media, perhaps their dream future for social media. So you've got a couple of minutes to think while Neil just responds to that specific point.
So, well, we have an open call. So if you're an economist and you're running in a university, not just in the UK, but we've got a group in the US and we've got a group in Italy and in Israel, then write to us, tell us what you're doing, write to our blog, tell us what you're doing, and we will let the community know. Because there are some very good stories out there, so we want to come back to us and we will turn this into positive.
No, I'm not an economist, but
no.
You know, the question is, universities want to attract students, so if there's movement in the market, you say we don't want that old stuff.
There's definitely been.
Have they adjusted?
Yes, definitely.
Examples in the UK?
There are different levels of adjustment. So what happened in Manchester was quite sad, I think, because the course the students put together with and they hired somebody temporarily for a year to run this course, and he moved out. But he got a job at another, I understand, he's been employed at another university. So the good ones, SOAS, Kingston, Greenwich, UWE, Leicester obviously, Leeds, and there's been movement in even some of the very mainstream departments. So it's definitely happening.
Thank you. So I'm going to come back to the sort of what we see as the future of social media within science.
Okay. So I guess Twitter's success amongst academics is quite surprising, bearing in mind you alluded to 20 words. This is like a nightmare for academics, a nightmare for them. But I think it's useful because so you can't express yourself particularly clearly, perhaps, but you do get access to a huge swathe of people who would never interact with normally, talking outside of this, I mean, it's not just within the academic side, I mean, you're just exposed to all kinds of members of the public, journalists, etc., to start talking about particular topics. So I think that will continue to be useful. I mean, what will happen in the future with technological platforms, it's hard to say. And if you do go through quite rapid, I mean, it feels like it's been around forever. I mean, it's only just, I think, 10 years old. And its use with academics is very recent, really. So quite hard to predict how it's going to happen. But there's still quite a big role for blogs as well, where you can still communicate fairly differently, plain language if you like. But you do have more room to express yourself if you want to.
There is an interesting persistence in some of the technologies we're using now. So the permanence of a blog or the permanence of a tweet. And so some of the interactions I have with some of the PhD students in our centre is they often use some of the less persistent technologies for their own communications because they start to become cautious about what we call their contextual digital footprints. And they are astute enough to realise that the opinion they have age 20-something might not be an opinion they want to stand by at age 40-something. So I think there's an interesting sort of perspective there.
Yeah. Well, I would be very careful about commenting on where things may go because I don't have mild influence. I think it would be people under the age of 20 at the moment who really make that decision. When we're using different platforms, certainly in an educational context, we let them choose their own platforms as a way of trying to figure out where things are going. Because, I mean, we have a platform for Blackboard, for example, inside the university for an electronic platform for education. But students don't want to use it, and if you let them use their own platforms, then you get a much better idea of where things are moving. So that's the approach.
Sylvia,
Discussions on Twitter about Bayesian inference usually has no linking anyone. But a lot of it is Bayesian versus non-Bayesian.
I mean, I think the feature of, I've taken my dog for a walk, or that's what I had for dinner, might be a bit difficult. But I think it's hard to tell. But it's like science itself, This is why a roadmap for the future of science is so difficult, right? Because, you think, oh, this is the next big thing. Usually it's the next big thing. It's not the next big thing. It's the thing that's past, and you're just sort of perfecting it a bit. So who knows what's going to happen in the next 10 years, right? I mean, it may be that I hope not, but we may do sort of video chats or whatever, but I think it is useful in terms of making connections with people. So I've met a lot of people here in person that I follow on Twitter, and that's really nice because you can actually have a discussion with them, and it prompts me to think about and talk about things like science and society, which, I'm sure I have lots of opinions, so I can sit at home and have my own opinions, but it's a venue by which you can outreach. And it's not just outreach sort of like I'm a scientist and my department told me I should go do outreach. It actually is, I think, quite useful. It's improved the way I write. So writing a blog has actually improved the way I even write for science, so writing down things like that. So I do think it's an incredibly useful skill. I mean, the other thing I will say though is I'm really grateful it wasn't around when I was 20. Right? All of this stupid stuff I do it doesn't have some sort of media imprint, but I do think that's a big caution is that when I started using Twitter, 10 people followed me or whatever, and they were my friends. So, and then you realize that my mother could read this, right? And so I think it's actually also good for arguing skills because you have 140 characters and you can choose to actually have a debate with something that's quite healthy. And I think that's good for science in general because just this idea of I'm just the great I am and say this is right, it doesn't work on Twitter. So I think it's actually quite good for that. I think it will continue to do so.
I'll just see if Neil has a question here. Okay, we can go to.
Yeah, so when I think of science on social media, there's one big example, which is a page on Facebook called something naughty, love science, which I guess most of you will probably have come across. Now, it's got 15 million likes, that's worth. So it's obviously an interesting platform for engaging people and raising awareness, which is a term I'm not looking for, but I like communicating science. I want more people to know about science. But I'm not actually sure if it's a good thing, this page. I've heard these opinions a few times, because on one side they might have a recap of the great research stories, and this thing I've just looked at one of the most recent posts is something suggesting that if you add together an incandescent light bulb and a Mr. Whippy ice cream, that's how you get energy-saving bulbs, because they kind of look the same. And so, this is a place that's spread science, but also that sort of thing. So I'm interested to hear what the panel think about things like that, because there's potential for good, but there's also potential for harm. That people think. I really don't know how to think about this page at the moment, so I'm wondering if you guys
I suppose my question is, does it matter what we think? You know, does it matter what our opinion is of the page? Because we have no control over it, really. So, I mean, I think it's a debate that you can get caught up in very quickly. You know, how do we feel about this, or how do we feel about that? The reality is, how do we feel about it personally probably can't have that much impact on how it develops. So,
well, in this case, but if we're trying to create something, we were talking about how we can use social media. So if we were trying to say recreate this, then obviously we need to have some sort of opinion about the right way to go about it. I mean, I don't understand the point that you have fairly certainly going to continue on with people think is whatever the circle square hashtag on Twitter can do. But that doesn't validate the discussion about it.
Question, it was more a kind of, you know, it's quite a hard reality to come to terms with, that a lot of the things that are happening now. I mean, for example, a lot of people moving to electronic books, and my son never picking up a book I find very difficult to come to terms with, but it's also something that I don't have a lot of control over, and I think things are moving very quickly at the moment in ways that I don't feel particularly comfortable with, but you know, it's trying to manage that relationship with what's happening, which is beyond control.
Perfectly sensible investigating questions, thanks to the other stuff. I would like to tie that text. That's a serious investigation.
So far the discussions here have been very focused around almost using social media for outreach and use of Twitter and communicating with the public. But there's other sorts of emerging social media in science by platforms such as ResearchGate, which have the potential to kind of transform how scientists work as a community. And I'm just wondering what your comments on the sort of internal emerging social media is.
Do you want to explain a little bit more about sort of the particular aspects of ResearchGate that you think are sort of transformative?
It's basically, I think there's quite a few examples, but it's like a Facebook for scientists. So people post on their questions that they have. So I've used it, and I've asked questions to you can ask a question, you can tag it with research fields, everyone else on there, that appears on their kind of feeds, and then you can start having discussions about aspects of science, which has been helpful to my research on a few occasions.
Contributions to you for me.
Yeah, there are some people that have to use it, and I think it's a great effect.
And it goes back to the point that we had about sort of breaking down barriers perhaps between the different levels of sort of seniority between those within the academic community.
And yeah, Club here is another example of a kind of social media example. Not sure if it's
my research gets sort of childish, profit-making, reproduce it really. I don't want to whereas public is serious criticism.
But I know that academic language has got to piece of research directly from the questions he asked in research. This sort of idea of cross-collaboration. You know, instead of going and spending 2 days searching on literature, you just said, anyone know how to do this, and have 3 answers very quickly. That's a really positive thing.
If I could ask the panel to respond.
This is kind of fascinating. I mean, I think one of the things that, I think that's a great idea, you know. I mean, I think one of the problems with it, though, in practicality, is the amount of time that I would have to sit and answer questions on ResearchGate about that. I mean, one of the things that's difficult is it is true, and one of the things social media helps with, and I think this really helps with, is instead of your paper going off into the world of, you know, I mean, I've never had a press release about my papers, right? But instead of going into the world of obscurity, people could ask you questions, which people tended to do at conferences and things like that. But now you have access to a much broader community. But I think it's a very good idea. I think in practice it's going to be really hard because it's difficult to. I just think I think practically it's quite difficult to answer questions. But the good thing is that it allows discussions, especially if you're trying to do a technique to complete an experiment, right? And you can Because we're never, our method sections are this big, so if it's things like, actually, I've got to shake this thing really hard, and then tell me that. I mean, this is where it's really, really useful. So I think that's really positive. It's a positive change. Yeah.
Very quickly, I no longer like or join a platform unless I know who the editor is. Because I want to have that connection and I want to know they're talking about something I'm interested in. So the example about the science one, if there's no transparency and I don't know anything on it, I'm just going to leave it. Because there's too many.
Yeah, research questions on very elementary in the graph. I did my first one answer was about non-linear regression, but I think most of the answers are very important.
If I can interrupt, because we have some good questions over here.
There's all people about time and they can't ask me problems of the world.
Okay, I partly want to pick up on Warren's comment about mainstream media using social media as kind of a way of picking up stories. I want everyone to kind of think a little bit. I worry about kind of feedback mechanisms and long-term consequences. Thinking about women's talk yesterday, because of course media organisations don't just use it to pick up stories that journalists cover, they actually use it as a source of free content. And all of us as academics need to think quite hard about our own direct communications, because this feeds into the issues around specialist journalism and de-skilling. There's a very interesting debate going on around photojournalism and photography, which I think all of us would do well to kind of look at that debate and look at what's happening around photojournalism, imagery on the internet, and think hard about whether what looks like good short-term solutions might be contributing to long-term problems. Maybe.
Thank you.
Are you talking? So you're talking about more about scientists perhaps writing full pieces like blog posts, I guess.
Yeah, more blog posts, but I think Twitter contributes to it because it's such a conduit to a lot of as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a culture change, which, as you say, kind of photographers, workshop writers, professional writers, John saying yesterday about how it's just hard for people to get paid, essentially. Huge businesses like Pearce have been made out of not paying their writers, paying their writers anything for the content, essentially. But on the other hand, for people working out in media, it's very tempting. It's someone from the Guardian purposes who'd like to write a blog post, and you'll get a big platform. And yeah, of course, but again, this is like a chipping away at this platform, chipping away at the problem, with science journalism. So I've done the same thing. I'm immune to that criticism at all. I don't know what the answer to that would be. Basically, I mean, one or two people have left entirely and tried to work as freelance science journalists and found it very difficult to get paid because of an expectation of work for nothing.
I think that has more to do with effort in the post though than it does with anything, because Huffington Post started this model, they don't pay for anything, they take this exposure, so I don't know if that's
I think as academics and researchers, sometimes we could be a little bit naive about what these large organisations and their interests
Tim Johnson from Harriet Watt. Neil and I have a commonality in that we're both quite unusual in that we come from the vernacular into the academic sphere. And I assure any PhD students it is weird in the academic sphere. Whenever citizen science is discussed, it concerns me because a lot of the times we want to use citizens as data gatherers, and we're not actually engaging them in science. And the best piece of citizen science that I ever came across was there was a debate, I think it was initiated by Paul Krugman, the economist in the States, did a blog post that another economist responded to, and then a computer scientist in the States said, okay, let's build a model to test the two hypotheses, and he closed the debate down because he did a 50 lines of Python for one change between the two models, lots of graphs, but so and so's wrong. End of debate. And that was, I think that's the sort of citizen science that we should be aspiring to. Certainly, I'm in the economic side of things. That's the sort of thing we should be interested in, rather than getting everybody to do our data gathering on the cheap for us. The other thing, there's a lot of links to open source. And one of the very interesting is Andy, was it Andy with John Turney? No, John Turney mentioned crowdfunding of journalism. Crowdfunding is the financial equivalent of open science, and it has the potential to be really disruptive of the financial system. And I've heard about this application of crowdfunding for journalism, and I've heard that journalists are saying this could be a big game changer. So I think, you know, perhaps open source science, citizen science, has the potential to be a game changer for the institutions as well.
I think there's already evidence that the crowdfunding model is changing things like webcomics, for example. There's some quite good examples there of comics that solely survive on crowdfunding models and quite speculative crowdfunding models in some cases. And I'm not the panel. There was a question just behind you, the lady with the glasses there.
Hi, June McCombie from Chemistry here. It's a follow-on really from Tim's question, just a sort of bit of addition, because what we haven't discussed at all, or I'd like the panel to give views on, is projects like Zooniverse, where we're not using, we're not asking the public to comment on our science via social media, but those projects are involving crowdsourcing, if you like, science participation by the public, at Zooniverse and Superposition in Leeds, and there is an equivalent in Nottingham that I've forgotten the name of.
Galaxy Zoo.
Galaxy Zoo, part of Zooniverse, I think, but But there is a public event in Nottingham every Wednesday night where the public are asked to go, invited to come and build things if they want to. So yeah, some comment on that type of citizen science and where you see that going.
Can I quickly respond to that? I'm starting to get, because of my research, I get students write to me and say, can you give me a project? And one of the best projects I can give them is, here's an old paper in economics, make an open source model of this, and there's lots of possibilities. But then when I'm teaching, or when the students come along, the next time I can say, here's a whole group of models you can use. I'd like to be able to pay them. Yeah, so some of these are students in good computer science grads in institutes in India, and I want to be able to say, well, look, you do this project every summer, here's a stipend. But it would be fantastic, because this, the one I'm thinking of in particular, and people are going to hate me because I can't remember the name, but that wonderful critique of the Reinhardt and Rogoff austerity paper, that was a replication study, and it was a very, very important replication study by a master's student. And that's really important public research, I think.
Anyone else want to respond on the citizen science sort of more?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you're absolutely right. And so what is more kind of interesting, I suppose, what I've seen in some of those discussions I've found about climate change is that they are generating new research questions, if you like, because they're coming, whether they're coming from people who are skeptics or who are more on the kind of environmental side, if you like, they are generating new questions about what we should be looking at downstream climate change and trying to, fill some of the gaps about whether it's what might happen in extreme temperature change, or trying to understand why temperatures haven't increased as they've expected in the last 20 years. And so that would really be a more meaningful way of talking about citizen science. It's kind of going back to the start and working out what research questions would be in some cases, particular projects, and going from start to finish on, and then just passing it to collect data.
Can I push back a little on that? So are we thinking that participating in things like, I've got the impression that participating in things like this is seen as almost a bit cheeky. We're asking people to do our analysis for us, and actually I've heard the alternative view that actually this is engaging people in understanding what the planet's surface of Mars looks like, and actually the rewarding thought that you might discover something new that no one else has discovered is thought to be a motivator in itself, but I'm getting quite a negative sense here, so I was wondering if there were any positives for all of this.
I would see it as quite positive. Anything that engages people and interests them in something more widely, I think is a positive thing. And I think also, although a lot of that has been based around software until relatively recently, things like the Internet of Things and Galileo boards from Intel and Raspberry Pi and things like that are now starting to open up kind of hardware possibilities, and the whole maker community around 3D printers and stuff like that is, well, I think that's probably going to be the next thing to really take off, bringing together the software and the hardware aspect that's now becoming much more accessible and affordable. Everybody will be able to crank it out.
It's not an either or, but yeah, it's hard, I guess, to ask members of the public what research should be as more in depth, and it involves relinquishing control as well.
Absolutely.
Just a very brief comment on Suzi's point. There's I wish I could remember. There's a crowdfunding platform for research projects in the US, and one of the rewards they offer in terms of return on investment is the ability to actually engage with the data and analyze the data. So there is, I think, a big appetite for actually making discoveries.
Thank you. Yeah. Over time for, okay, we've got one question here and then final question over there. So the first one here.
Just a quick follow-up question to Warren. Do you know what were the reactions of the scientists who got responses from the audience suggesting in which direction they should go with their research? Because I remember one case, a similar case in biosciences, where the scientists were really upset. What are these people to tell us what to do? And I think this question does apply not just to natural scientists, but to us social scientists as well. Are we really happy when someone tells us, okay, you should do this and that in research?
No. The scientists, so the kind of scientists who are on that network map is certainly less than 10, maybe even about 5 who are actively engaged and have made a very open decision to actively engage with people who are very critical of various aspects of climate change. But it's very much the exception and not the norm. And I think they've got various reasons for doing that. I mean, some of it goes back to the stuff Roger was saying about being honest brokers. Some of it is about they think that engagement is a way of increasing trust in science. They may not reach the same conclusion, they probably won't reach a consensus between them, but having that discussion is a way of legitimising their endeavours more, I think, than rather just setting themselves back. And some of the stuff that skeptics have talked about slow down intelligence, they are having to do more scientific work on that because it was a gap in the last IPCC report.
Okay, so I think our final question.
Well, I just wanted to address what Suzi was saying about how wonderful it would be if everybody has a lab at home. There have been 2 projects that were funded by Kickstarter, which I think are very good examples of what might happen with that. One was an uncontrolled release of glowing plants into the environment, which would have been the world's first uncontrolled release of a synthetically engineered organism. And the other was a project of implanting electrodes in the brains of cockroaches and then controlling them from your mobile phone. So I'm very, very wary when people say, oh, how wonderful it would be. We'll have labs at home and it will be wonderful. And you hear this a lot from the Symbio community. But you're also talking about science being done with no ethics, no oversight, no regulation, some of which actually could have extraordinarily damaging consequences for the environment.
Thank you. So I'd just like to ask all of the members of the panel if they'd just like to make any final points in response to anything that's come up today or anything further point. We're keeping people from our lunch, so... Let's go. Okay, so...
Can I just respond to that last point, because I think, again, it comes down to what you can and can't control. And I think the only way that you can really have any influence over the kind of things that you're talking about is through education. Unless we address ethics and things like that in the education system, kids are always going to go out and torture insects. So, I think trying to prevent people having labs in their own homes is not the direction.
thanking our panellists and thanking you for your